The air in St. Mary's Trauma Center hung heavy that Tuesday evening, thick with the sterile tang of antiseptic and the low hum of fluorescent lights. It was a deceptive calm, the kind that made seasoned nurses uneasy, as if the world was holding its breath before chaos erupted. At 23, Elise Harper was the youngest nurse in the unit, her dark braid tucked neatly under her cap, her hazel eyes sharp despite the long shift. Her hands, steady from years of training, moved with quiet confidence as she checked charts, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. She wasn't ready for what was about to crash through those double doors, though no one could have been. 40 minutes into her shift, the emergency line crackled to life. Code red, incoming, male, critical, multiple gunshot wounds, ETA, 5 minutes. Elise's pulse quickened, her body shifting into muscle memory. The trauma bay snapped into motion. Techs scrambled to prep tables, carts of gleaming instruments rolled into place, and the overhead lights flared like a spotlight on a battlefield. Elise tightened her gloves, her breath steady, but her heart pounding. The team braced for the worst, but the worst was beyond imagination. A blacked-out SUV roared into the ambulance bay, tires screeching against the asphalt. No paramedics, no stretcher, just two men in dark tactical gear, their faces grim, dragging a blood-soaked figure between them. The doors burst open, and the air shifted, heavy with urgency. The man they carried was massive, his frame solid despite the way he sagged, his tactical vest shredded, blood pooling beneath him. His face, partially obscured by sweat and grime, was set in a grimace, his breath shallow and ragged. "We need a surgeon now!" one of the men barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "He's one of ours. He lives, or you answer to us." Elise stepped forward, her instincts overriding the panic around her. "What happened?" she asked, already pressing her fingers to the man's neck, feeling the faint, erratic pulse. His body was a map of destruction. Chest, arms, thighs, all riddled with wounds. Blood seeped through her gloves, warm and relentless. "Ambush!" the second man growled, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting trouble to follow. "He took over 30 rounds. You don't save him, you're done." The room froze. The on-call surgeon was stuck in traffic, miles away, unreachable. The charge nurse, a veteran named Clara, hesitated, her face pale. "Elise, we can't—" she started, but Elise cut her off. "No time," she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "Prep the bay. Suction, clamps, irrigation. I'm going in." "Elise, you're not authorized!" Clara's voice trembled, but Elise was already moving, her hands guiding the team as if she'd done this 100 times. She wasn't a surgeon, but she'd seen enough trauma to know the dance of life and death. The patient was laid on the table, his gear cut away to reveal a body torn apart by bullets, entry wounds, exit wounds, some lodged deep in muscle and bone. Over 30, they'd said. Elise counted silently as she worked. 32, 35. More. The room became a blur of motion and sound, monitors beeping, suction hissing, metal clinking against metal. Elise's hands moved with precision, her mind locked in a singular focus. She found the first bullet, lodged in his shoulder, and extracted it with a steady pull, clamping the artery before blood could flood the site. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her scrub cap damp against her hairline. "Suction!" she called, her voice calm but firm. The team followed her lead, their doubt giving way to trust. He coded once, his heart flatlining on the monitor. Elise didn't hesitate. "Charge to 200!" she ordered, pressing the paddles to his chest. The shock jolted him back, his pulse flickering to life. She didn't pause to celebrate. There were more bullets to find. 5 extracted, then 10, 15. Her hands ached, her arms burned, but she kept going, each slug dropping into the metal tray with a soft clink. The man in tactical gear stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Elise. His presence was a weight, a reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just a patient. This was someone who carried secrets, someone the government needed alive. And Elise, a nurse with no surgical clearance, was his only hope. 20 bullets. 25. The tray filled, each slug a testament to her resolve. The man's vitals began to stabilize, his blood pressure creeping upward. "We're not done," Elise murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the room. The final bullets were the hardest, deep in his abdomen, where a single misstep could rupture organs. She took a breath, her fingers steady despite the exhaustion creeping into her bones. One by one, she found them, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision she didn't know she possessed. 40 minutes later, 37 bullets sat in the tray. The man's chest rose and fell, steady now, a living miracle under the harsh lights. Elise stepped back, her gloves slick with blood, her body trembling from the effort. The room was silent except for the monitors, the team staring at her in quiet awe. One nurse, eyes wet, whispered, "You did it." The man in tactical gear stepped forward, his face unreadable. "You're insane," he said, his voice low, but not unkind. "And you saved him." Elise looked at the man on the table, his breathing steady, his life no longer slipping away. "Just doing my job," she said softly. But even she knew it was more than that. This was the moment she'd trained for. The moment she'd become a nurse for. But as she peeled off her gloves, her hands shaking, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line, one that would come with a cost. The hallway outside the trauma bay was dim, the flickering lights casting long shadows. Elise walked slowly, her scrubs stiff with dried blood, her body heavy with adrenaline's aftermath. Nurses and techs glanced at her as she passed, some with awe, others with unease. No one spoke. In the locker room, she sat on a bench, peeling off her gloves one finger at a time, her hands throbbing. Pride burned in her chest, but so did something else. Doubt. She'd saved a life, but at what price? She didn't know it yet, but the hospital's gears were already turning. Memos were being drafted, meetings called. Her badge, still clipped to her scrubs, was already marked. By morning, her world would unravel. The morning sun spilled through the blinds of St. Mary's Trauma Center, casting thin golden lines across the linoleum floors. Elise Harper trudged up the steps, her body heavy with exhaustion, her scrubs still flecked with the soldier's blood. She hadn't slept more than a few hours, her mind replaying the chaos of the night before, the weight of forceps in her hand, the clink of bullets in the tray, the faint pulse that had fought to stay alive. At 23, she'd done the impossible. She'd saved a man, a soldier, maybe someone who carried secrets bigger than her world. Pride flickered in her chest, but it was fragile, like a candle in a storm. The hospital felt different today. The usual hum of morning chatter was muted, replaced by an eerie quiet. Nurses she'd laughed with over coffee avoided her gaze. Techs busied themselves with charts as she passed. Even the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Elise's brow furrowed, her steps slowing. Something was wrong. She glanced down at her scrubs, the rust-colored stains a stark reminder of the night's battle. Maybe that was it. Maybe they were just shaken by what they'd all witnessed. Then the PA system crackled. "Nurse Elise Harper, report to administration, immediately!" The voice was sharp, clinical, not the usual warmth of the desk clerk. Elise's stomach twisted. She adjusted her badge, her fingers brushing the laminated photo of her younger self, smiling, hopeful. She walked toward the administrative wing, her sneakers squeaking louder in the silence. The bulletin boards along the corridor boasted "Excellence in Care" and "Teamwork Saves Lives." But the words felt hollow now, like promises no one intended to keep. The glass doors of the admin office loomed ahead. Elise pushed them open, her heart thudding. Inside, the room was cold, sterile. 2 security guards stood by the wall, their faces blank. A woman from HR, her glasses perched low on her nose, sat at the table, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of her. Dr. Raymond Kessler, the chief of staff, leaned against the desk, his gray suit crisp, his expression unreadable. Elise's throat tightened. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Sit, Elise," Dr. Kessler said, his tone clipped but not cruel. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The HR woman cleared her throat, her eyes fixed on the papers. "We've reviewed the events of last night. Multiple violations of hospital protocol were identified. Unauthorized surgical procedure, operating without attending oversight, breach of liability protocols." Her words were mechanical, each one landing like a stone. "Given the severity, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Elise's breath caught, her mind reeling. "Terminate," she whispered, the word foreign, impossible. "I saved his life. He was dying." Dr. Kessler sighed, his arms unfolding. "You did what you thought was right, Elise. No one disputes that. But this is a civilian hospital. We don't answer to the military. There were no consents, no clearances. You exposed us to significant legal risk." "Risk?" Elise's voice cracked, anger flaring beneath the shock. "I wasn't thinking about risk. I was thinking about his pulse stopping, about blood pooling on the floor. I was the only one who could act." "And you did," Kessler said, his tone softening, almost regretful. "But that doesn't change the rules. You acted alone, without authorization. That's not how this works." Elise's hands trembled, her nails digging into her palms. 12 hours ago, she'd held a man's life in her hands, her focus razor-sharp, her heart steady. Now, she was being told that courage was a liability, that saving a life was a mistake. The HR woman slid an envelope across the table. "Your severance, 1 week's pay. Please return your badge and any hospital property." One of the guards stepped forward, his presence looming. Elise stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She unclipped her badge, the plastic warm from her body, and placed it on the table. It felt like surrendering a piece of herself. The laminated photo stared up at her, that hopeful smile now a ghost of who she'd been. "This isn't personal," the HR woman said, her voice flat. "It's policy." Elise's gaze locked on her. Then why does it feel like betrayal? No one answered. The guards flanked her, guiding her through the halls she'd walked 1,000 times, past nurses she'd trained with, doctors she'd assisted, patients who'd once thanked her with teary smiles. Now, they stared. Some with pity, some with confusion, some with judgment. Her cheeks burned, her throat tight with humiliation. The staff entrance buzzed open, and she stepped into the blinding morning sun, alone. She stood by her car, the hospital looming behind her like a fortress she'd once called home. Her hands clutched her scrubs, the bloodstains now a mark of shame. She slid into the driver's seat, staring at the steering wheel, her reflection in the windshield a stranger. Her phone buzzed, a text from a colleague. "I'm so sorry, Elise. We know what you did was right." Another followed. "They're just scared. That's all this is." But fear didn't erase the sting. Fear didn't give her job back. Elise drove home in silence, the city blurring past her. Her apartment was small, cluttered with secondhand furniture and fading plants. She dropped her keys into a chipped ceramic bowl, the clink echoing in the quiet. Her badge lay on the counter where she'd tossed it, the photo staring up like an accusation. She sank into a chair. Still in her bloodied scrubs, her body heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. She'd saved a man's life, a soldier, a hero, and they'd cast her out for it. The silence in her apartment was deafening, louder than the trauma bay's chaos. She stared at her phone, willing it to light up with a call, a message, something to prove this wasn't the end. But the screen stayed dark. No one reached out, not the nurses she'd worked beside, not the doctors she'd supported. The hospital had closed ranks, and she was on the outside. She walked to the bathroom, her reflection in the mirror gaunt, her eyes hollow. Doubt crept in, cold and sharp. Had she been reckless? Had she overstepped? The system cared about paperwork, not heartbeats, and she'd chosen the latter. She slid to the floor, her back against the cool tile, her knees pulled to her chest. The weight of the night pressed down. Blood, bullets, the man's faint pulse. She'd acted because no one else would. She'd honored her oath to save lives. But now, jobless and alone, she wondered if that oath was worth the cost. The days blurred into a haze for Elise Harper. 5 mornings had passed since St. Mary's had stripped her of her badge, her purpose, her place. Her Houston apartment, once a cozy refuge with its mismatched cushions and flickering candles, now felt like a cage. The silence was relentless, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the distant wail of a siren. Her phone sat untouched on the kitchen table, its screen dark except for the occasional spam call. No colleagues reached out. No apologies came. The world she'd poured herself into had turned its back, and the quiet was a punishment all its own. Elise sat on her sagging couch, wrapped in a faded gray sweater, her dark hair loose and tangled. The blood-stained scrubs were gone, stuffed into a laundry basket she couldn't bring herself to touch. Her hospital badge lay on the coffee table, its laminated edges curling slightly, the photo of her younger self a painful reminder of what she'd lost. She traced a finger over it, the plastic cool against her skin. That badge had been her key to a world where she mattered, where her hands could pull someone back from the edge. Now it was just a relic, a ghost of a life that no longer belonged to her. She hadn't eaten properly since the firing. Her stomach growled, but the thought of food made her nauseous. She sipped lukewarm tea, the mug's warmth a small comfort against the chill in her chest. Outside, Houston moved on. Cars honked, joggers pounded the pavement, life pulsed forward. But inside these walls, time had stopped. Elise's mind replayed the trauma bay endlessly. The soldier's shredded body, the clink of bullets in the tray, the moment his heart restarted under her hands. She'd saved him. She knew she had. Yet the hospital had branded her a liability, a rule breaker, a risk. Doubt gnawed at her. What if they were right? What if her instincts had been reckless? She'd acted without clearance, without a surgeon's approval. The system valued signatures and protocols over lives, and she'd defied it. Her oath, to do no harm, to protect life, had guided her hands that night, but it couldn't shield her now. She leaned back, closing her eyes, willing the memories to fade. But they didn't. The soldier's faint pulse, the weight of his blood-soaked gear, the way the room had held its breath. They haunted her. The 6th morning dawned gray and heavy. Elise sat on her apartment's small balcony, her sweater pulled tight against the early chill. The city sprawled below, indifferent. She held a cold coffee, its surface rippling slightly in her unsteady hands. The silence was broken by a low, distant thrum, a sound that stirred something primal in her gut. She set the mug down, her pulse quickening. The noise grew louder, a rhythmic pulse cutting through the morning air. Helicopter blades. She stood, her breath catching as she leaned over the railing. 2 black military helicopters emerged over the skyline, their sleek forms slicing through the clouds. They weren't passing by. They were descending, their shadows sweeping across the apartment complex. Car alarms wailed as the rotor wash stirred dust and leaves. Neighbors spilled onto their balconies, phones raised, voices buzzing with confusion. "What the hell?" someone shouted. A child pointed, wide-eyed. Elise's heart pounded, fear and awe tangling in her chest. The helicopters hovered low, one settling just above the parking lot, the other circling slowly. The wind whipped her hair across her face, her sweater flapping like a sail. Doors slid open and 4 figures stepped out, their boots heavy on the asphalt. Tactical gear, dark sunglasses, rigid postures Lay stood at the base of Elise's porch steps. He removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp gray eyes that locked onto her with unnerving precision. "Elise Harper?" he said, his voice carrying over the fading rotor noise. She nodded. her throat tight. Yes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope, its edges sharp and official. Then, to her shock, he stepped back and saluted her, his posture rigid with respect. The other officers stood in formation behind him, their presence a silent command. "You saved one of ours," he said, his voice steady but warm. "We don't forget that." Elise's hands trembled as she took the envelope. The crowd around her, neighbors, strangers, a growing knot of onlookers, gasped and whispered. She broke the seal, her fingers unsteady. Inside was a letter, embossed with the Navy's seal, its words formal yet heartfelt. Beneath it a check for $75,000. Her breath caught. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You acted when no one else could," the commander said. "You saved a Tier 1 operator. 37 bullets, no surgeon, no backup. He's alive because of you. This is our gratitude." One of the officers stepped forward, holding a small velvet box. Inside gleamed a silver medal, engraved with an eagle and the words "Civilian Valor," a rare honor awarded to fewer than 100 civilians for acts of extraordinary bravery. Elise's lip trembled as she took it, its weight grounding her in the surreal moment. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because you did what was right," he said, his gaze softening. "And you did it better than anyone could have." The crowd erupted, claps, cheers, whistles rising like a wave. Elise stood frozen, the medal in one hand, the letter and check in the other, as the wind from the helicopters tugged at her sweater. Tears stung her eyes. For days she'd been invisible, shamed, discarded. Now she was seen, honored, believed. The commander shook her hand, his grip firm. "Thank you," he said. "No," Elise replied, her voice raw. "Thank you." The officers returned to their helicopters, the engines roaring back to life. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, their shadows shrinking, Elise remained on her porch, the crowd still cheering. The silence that had crushed her was gone, replaced by a new sound. Validation. She clutched the medal, its edges pressing into her palm, and let the tears fall. She hadn't just saved a life. She'd reclaimed her own. The world shifted under Elise Harper in the days that followed. The helicopters had barely faded from the Houston skyline when her story exploded. A shaky video captured by a neighbor's phone showed the military salute on her porch, 2 black helicopters, a commander's crisp gesture, and Elise, wide-eyed, clutching an envelope. Posted to social media, it racked up millions of views overnight. By morning, local news vans lined her street, their antennas piercing the sky like arrows. Headlines flashed across screens. "Fired nurse saves soldier's life, honored by Navy." National outlets followed, then international. Elise's name was everywhere, a spark that ignited a firestorm of attention. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of silence, became a battleground of notifications. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Reporters, talk shows, even a podcast host who called her the nurse who defied the odds. Elise ignored most of it, her thumb hovering over the screen, unsure how to navigate this sudden spotlight. She wasn't a hero in her own mind, just a nurse who'd done her job. But the world saw something else, a symbol of courage, a woman who'd stood against a system and won. 2 days after the helicopters, Elise found herself in a small community center, its stage bathed in the warm glow of spotlights. Rows of folding chairs held reporters, military officials, and locals who'd heard her story. The air hummed with anticipation, camera lenses glinting like eyes in the dark. Elise sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her navy dress simple but sharp, her dark hair pulled back in a low bun. She hadn't wanted fanfare, but the Navy had insisted on a ceremony, a public acknowledgement of her valor. She agreed, not for herself, but for the truth she'd fought to keep alive. A Navy officer in dress whites stepped to the podium, the American flag and seal trident standing proud behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "we are here to honor Elise Harper, a civilian who showed extraordinary courage. She saved the life of a Tier 1 operator, a man whose identity remains classified for national security. Under impossible pressure, with no surgeon and no clearance, she acted. And because of her, he's alive. The room erupted in applause. Elise's cheeks warmed, her pulse racing as she stood and walked to the stage, her steps deliberate but unsteady. The commander from her porch approached, his silver eagles catching the light. He placed the Civilian Valor Medal around her neck, its ribbon cool against her skin, its weight a quiet anchor. He leaned in, his voice low. "You were his lifeline. Never forget that." Elise nodded, swallowing hard. The officer handed her the microphone, and the room fell silent, every eye on her. She hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't rehearsed. All she had was the truth, raw and unpolished. "I don't know what to say," she started, her voice soft but clear, trembling at the edges. "I didn't plan for this. I didn't wake up thinking I'd be here. I was just a nurse, doing what I was trained to do." The crowd leaned in, hanging on her words. "That night, I saw a man dying. 37 bullets, no surgeon, no time. I didn't think about protocols or consequences. I thought about his heartbeat, about giving him a chance to see his family again. That's what nurses do. We act when lives are on the line." She paused, her fingers brushing the metal. "I lost my job for it. I lost my peace. But I'd do it again, every time, because he's alive, and that's enough." A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the stage lights. "Thank you to the Navy for seeing me, for believing in what I did, and thank you to everyone who shared my story, who reminded me I wasn't alone. I don't want fame. I just want to know I made a difference." The applause was thunderous, rolling through the room like a wave. People stood, some wiping tears, others nodding as if her words had struck a chord deep within. Reporters typed furiously, their cameras flashing. Elise stepped back, the medal heavy against her chest, her heart lighter than it had been in days. For the first time since the hospital doors closed behind her, she felt seen, not as a liability, but as a force. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed, their questions sharp but respectful. "How do you feel about the hospital's decision?" one asked. Elise's response was measured. "They made their choice. I made mine. I can live with mine." Her words trended online within hours. Hashtags like #NurseHero and #Elise Harper lighting up social media. Nurses across the country rallied behind her, their posts a chorus of solidarity. She did what we're trained to do. The system failed her, not the other way around. The attention was overwhelming. But it wasn't empty. Offers came, hospitals, clinics, even a university asking her to speak. Elise read each letter carefully, her hand steady now, her doubt fading. She didn't need redemption. She'd never been the one in the wrong. The world was just catching up to her truth. That night, she sat in her apartment, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands. The TV played a clip of her speech, her face unfamiliar in its quiet strength. She watched herself, the woman who'd stood on that stage, and felt a spark of recognition. This was who she'd always been, not a victim, but a survivor, a nurse who chose life over fear. The headline scrolled across the screen, "Elise Harper, the nurse who saved a soldier and stood tall." She smiled faintly, the first real smile in days. The silence was gone. In its place, a new chapter was beginning. The Colorado sky was a sharp, endless blue as Elise Harper stepped off the plane in Denver, her breath misting in the crisp mountain air. Two small suitcases trailed behind her, their wheels clicking against the tarmac. Tucked inside her coat pocket was the Navy's letter, its creases worn from being read and reread. It had been just 10 days since the helicopters descended on her Houston apartment, 9 since the world crowned her a hero. But here, in the shadow of the Rockies, she wasn't chasing applause. She was chasing purpose. Northview Medical Center stood modest but proud, its glass facade catching the morning sun like a beacon. It wasn't the towering complex of St. Mary's. but it felt alive, its pulse steady with the hum of care. Elise approached the entrance, her boots crunching on the gravel path, her heart steady but expectant. The Navy's medal rested in her bag, not for display, but as a reminder of what she'd fought for. She wasn't here to be a symbol. She was here to be a nurse. The receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, looked up as Elise entered. "You're Miss Harper, aren't you?" she said, standing quickly. "They're waiting for you." Elise nodded, a flicker of unease passing through her. The attention still felt foreign, like a coat that didn't quite fit. But the warmth in the woman's voice, the absence of judgment, grounded her. She was led through clean, bustling corridors, past nurses who offered quiet smiles and doctors who nodded in respect. No one whispered behind her back. No one averted their eyes. The air carried the familiar scent of antiseptic. But it was different here. Less sterile, more human. At the end of the emergency wing, a glass door bore her name in elegant silver letters: Elise Harper, RN, Director of Emergency Response. She paused, her fingers brushing the inscription, a quiet thrill running through her. This wasn't just a job. It was a home. Inside her office, a simple desk held a stack of leadership books, a new white coat folded neatly, and a handwritten note from the staff. "We're honored to have you." Elise smiled, the weight of the past weeks lifting slightly. She didn't linger in the office. Instead, she walked the ER floor, her eyes sharp, her hands ready. She checked charts, spoke softly to a child with a broken arm, reassured a worried mother. She listened, learned, belonged. By dusk, as the mountains glowed purple against the fading light, she stood outside, her coat wrapped tight, her breath curling in the cold. Northview buzzed behind her, a place that had chosen her not as a scandal, but as a strength. Months later, Elise found herself on a Navy base in Virginia, the air thick with the salt of the nearby ocean. She stood outside a recovery room, her hands clasped, her heart calm. Inside, the soldier she'd saved sat upright, his frame still broad but no longer fragile. Scars traced his arms and chest, a map of the night they'd shared. His name was classified, his face unfamiliar now without the pallor of death, but his eyes, steady, grateful, met hers with a quiet understanding. "You didn't have to come," he said, his voice rough but warm. "I wanted to," Elise replied. "To see you, not the patient." He nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "I owe you my life." She shook her head. "You gave me something too, a reason to keep going." They shook hands, a simple gesture, no ceremony needed. Just two people bound by a moment that had changed them both. As she left the room, a young nurse approached, her uniform crisp, her badge gleaming. "Miss Harper?" she said, her voice trembling with awe. "I read about you. You're why I became a nurse. You showed me we can still make a difference." Elise paused, her heart swelling. She placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Then promise me this," she said softly. "When it's right, don't wait for permission. Act." The girl nodded, her eyes bright with conviction. Behind them, the faint hum of helicopters rose, their blades cutting through the sky. Elise glanced up, watching them climb, not in urgency but in salute. She turned back to the road ahead, her steps light, her purpose clear. She wasn't defined by what she'd lost. Her job, her peace, her old life. She was defined by what she'd done, by the life she'd saved, by the truth she'd refused to let die. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the base in gold. Elise walked toward the gates, the wind lifting her hair, the flag snapping overhead. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a beacon, proof that doing the right thing could cost everything, but was never in vain. The world had tried to silence her, but she'd found her voice, and it echoed louder than ever. If you were moved by Elise Harper's journey from a night of impossible choices